And so now we get to the part that you've all been waiting for, just as you were waiting for the role of money in politics. We are now to the committee system and how it works, because I'm sure that's exactly why you started taking this course. But in some ways, understanding how the committee system works tells us a lot about some of the dynamics we've been talking about, both with campaigns and elections, political parties, and it doesn't do. Even On Just a Bill, as we said, recognizes the importance of the committees. Most of the work is done by committees, not done by the full House or by the full Senate. Aggregate numbers that says that 10% of bills considered by a committee actually make it to the floor of that chamber for a vote. And so again, most bills die in committee. It also is the case that if a bill does get out of committee, it has a 90% chance of getting passed by the House or by the Senate. So it dies in committee, but if it's successful, it'll probably be passed by that chamber. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that thing will actually become law because, as we know from the system of separation of powers and checks and balances, a number of other institutions have to sign off on it. But if a bill in the House of Representatives passes out of the Energy Committee, for example, it is about 90% certain that it will pass that chamber. But if, in fact, the U.S. Senate has different viewpoints, they might not even take up the legislation, or they have such a different view that the House and the Senate can't actually compromise. If they do, that bill could still be vetoed by the President of the United States. That could, and even then, it could be ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. So the system of checks and balances and separation of powers still exists. But you do see the power of committees, that if you want a piece of legislation to advance in the process by getting through that chamber, it's got to get through the committees first. Most amendments, riders, most of the goodies that are packed into these bills are done at the committee and the subcommittee stage. And that is why members of Congress want to get on those committees to be able to add those goodies, those riders, those earmarks, to make it possible to, if that legislation passes, to give some money to their district or their state, and then they can point that out when they're running for re-election, all the great things that they've done for their district and their state. It is also, there's not a heck of a lot of media coverage on the entire House and the Senate, but there is even less of nothing done about the committees and subcommittees. So this can often be done not completely in secret, not completely quietly, but it is something that can be done in a quieter fashion. That's a lot harder for we the people to find out what those amendments were and why they were put in. So in that sense, you get it's efficient in the sense of being able to deliver goodies without people recognizing that that's going on. The other thing is that incumbency work together. The incumbency effect is that members of Congress will try to get on the committees that will allow them to deliver like a laser beam the goodies to their district or to their state. Furthermore, the longer they are there, the more power they have in that committee. They move up, and then eventually their party's in the majority. If their party's not, they're a ranking member of that, and so of that committee or subcommittee. And with that comes real power in terms of deciding what members of the executive branch will be brought in if you're doing oversight. Which interest groups are going to be brought in to provide testimony about the implications of what these bills are going to do. So there's a lot of influence that these committees have on how bills are shaped, and so members want to get onto those. We talked about this idea of whether you're in the majority or not, and so this is an important linkage between political parties, and that is that the committee system is set up so that whatever party has a majority of seats in the legislature, not majority support of voters, but majority of seats in the legislature, majority of every single committee in that legislature. And furthermore, they chair every single one of those committees. And that's a lot of power. And so you have that in the House of Representatives right now, in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Democrats, because they have a majority of seats in the overall body in the House of Representatives, have a majority of seats in every single committee and have chair every single committee in the House of Representatives. In the U.S. Senate, because Republicans have a majority of seats in the Senate, they have a majority of seats in every single one of the committees in the U.S. Senate. And the Republican chairs every single committee in the U.S. Senate. That's a considerable amount of power. And in California, the state legislature is run the same way because Democrats have an overwhelming majority, a two-thirds majority in both the state assembly and the state senate. They have a two-thirds majority in the committees and subcommittees in the state assembly, and they also chair those. So it's a considerable amount of power that is given to the political parties, to be able to control legislation. And as we talked about when we talked about the single member district plurality, if in fact that majority in seats doesn't really represent the majority of interests of the people, you can see again why there is this gap in that the real power comes in terms of having the majority of seats to be able to pass the legislation, to write the legislation the way that you want to, actually fit with what Americans want or Californians want. And so that gap that we see in terms of popular sovereignty because of the single member district plurality really clearly in the committees and subcommittees of the legislatures. And so then it does lead people to ask the question, is the committee system completely self-serving to the members and to the parties? The answer is yes and no. It's social science. So in some ways you can see, because of party politics and the incumbency and the way in which committees are set up and do their work as a way for members of Congress to run for re-election, the way in which political parties can dominate those and the discussions, even if they don't really have an actual support from the people for the ideas and the agenda that they want to advance. That is certainly a concern, that these committee systems are self-serving and allow politicians and political parties to do. But there is still the role of expertise. Expertise can develop because members of Congress are there for a long period of time, because they don't have to serve on every single committee. They don't have to be experts on banking, agriculture, education, foreign affairs, things like that, that they can specialize. And that specialization might allow them the ability to develop some actual expertise that will help better legislation. But it is also a way for them to be continually influenced by the interest groups and the lobbyists who are there to make sure that whatever bills are passed are ones that are going to protect the interests of those interest groups.